She stood there in my custom-designed living room, her baby bump draped in designer silk, raising a toast at my 40th birthday party as she announced she was carrying my husband's child. What neither of them knew was that by the time the birthday cake was served, I would destroy not just their relationship, but Craig's entire career and reputation. "I know this is unexpected," Vanessa said, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly as she stood beside my visibly uncomfortable husband. "But Craig and I wanted you all to be the first to know. We're engaged and expecting a little one in just 2 months." The elegant champagne flute in my hand remained perfectly steady as 50 of our closest friends and family members gasped. Collectively. My carefully planned birthday celebration at our Westlake estate, the home Craig and I had spent 8 years renovating, had suddenly transformed into my public humiliation. Craig's arm draped awkwardly around Vanessa's shoulders, his Rolex glinting under the custom chandelier I'd selected last year. The same chandelier that had been delivered on the day I'd first noticed a suspicious text on his phone. I studied them from across the room, my expression revealing nothing of the storm raging inside me. Craig shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, but Vanessa beamed with triumph, the diamond on her finger catching the light. My grandmother's ring that had mysteriously disappeared during our vacation to Santorini last summer. "Rebecca," Craig finally stammered, finding his voice. "I wanted to tell you privately, but Vanessa felt everyone should know at once." He cleared his throat, his practiced CEO voice faltering. "I've already spoken with my lawyer about settlement. Terms, you'll be taken care of, I promise. Before we continue with what happened next, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this wild ride, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's video reveals exactly how I spent 6 months plotting the perfect revenge against both of them." I allowed myself a small smile, taking a deliberate sip of Dom Perignon, Craig's favorite champagne that I'd specifically ordered for this evening. My lawyer had advised against this public confrontation, suggesting we handle everything through proper legal channels. But proper had never been my style, especially not after discovering the depth of Craig's betrayal. "How thoughtful of you both," I replied, my voice carrying just enough warmth to confuse everyone in the room. "Though I'm curious, Vanessa. Did Craig tell you how you two first met?" Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. "At the company retreat last year, he was giving a presentation on the future of Meridian Tech." She squeezed Craig's arm possessively. "It was love at first sight." I nodded sympathetically. "That's a lovely story, but incomplete." I turned to address our stunned guests. What Craig apparently failed to mention was that Vanessa was hired as my personal assistant 3 years ago. I personally trained her, brought her into our home, and even helped her furnish her apartment when she complained about not being able to afford decent furniture on her entry-level salary. Craig's face had begun to pale, the confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and investor meetings visibly crumbling. He knew me too well to think this would end with just public embarrassment. 15 years of marriage had taught him that I never entered a battle I hadn't already won. My sister Eleanor materialized at my side, her hand gently squeezing my shoulder in silent support. She'd been the first person I'd called 6 months ago when I'd discovered the affair, and the only one who knew exactly what was about to unfold. "Rebecca, can we please discuss this privately?" Craig pleaded, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. Glanced at my watch, a vintage Cartier that Craig had given me on our 10th anniversary. "Actually, your timing is perfect. I've arranged for a special birthday surprise." I nodded to Eleanor, who tapped a discreet command on her phone. The massive television screen that dominated one wall of our living room flickered to life, displaying a live feed of the downtown skyline, specifically focused on the gleaming glass and steel. Meridian Tech headquarters, the crown jewel of Craig's business empire. "Beautiful building, isn't it?" I mused, watching Craig's expression. 32 floors of prime downtown real estate, currently valued at just over $78 million. Vanessa looked confused, her hand still protectively cradling. Her belly. What does your company's building have to do with anything? I smiled, savoring the moment. That's an interesting question, Vanessa. You see, while Craig has been busy building his tech empire and apparently starting his second family, I've been making some investments of my own. The room had gone completely silent, every guest transfixed by the unfolding drama. My mother stood in the corner, her hand pressed to her mouth. She'd warned me about Craig's ambition when I'd first brought him home 15 years ago, the hungry look in his eyes that she'd recognized from my father before he'd abandoned us with nothing. Rebecca, Craig's voice had taken on a warning tone, his CEO authority attempting to reassert itself. This isn't the time or place for what? I interrupted. For honesty? For consequences? I think our guests deserve to know exactly what kind of man you are. I turned to the group, my voice steady. 3 months ago, I received some interesting documents from my financial advisor. It seems that the holding company that owns the Meridian Tech building was looking for a silent partner, an investor who could provide significant capital in exchange for majority ownership. Craig's face had lost all color now as realization began to dawn. He'd been struggling to secure funding for his newest product launch, complaining for months about cash flow issues despite the company's apparent success. "You wouldn't," he whispered. "Wouldn't I?" I raised my champagne in a mocking toast. "Happy birthday to me, darling. As of last week, I own 62% of Westlake Commercial Properties, which means I now control the building where Meridian Tech is headquartered. The building with the lease coming up for renewal next month." Vanessa turned to Craig, confusion clouding her features. "What is she talking about? You said the lease was secured for another 5 years." I laughed, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Oh, Vanessa, there's so much Craig hasn't told you." Eleanor handed me a sleek leather portfolio, the same one Craig's lawyer had delivered to me last week with proposed divorce terms that would have left me with barely 20% of our marital assets. I opened it slowly, extracting a single document. "This evening is just beginning," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "And trust me when I say, neither of you is prepared for what comes next." Craig lunged forward, reaching for the document in my hand, but Eleanor smoothly stepped between us. My sister, always my protector, even when we were children, fixed him with the same icy stare she used in the courtroom as one of Boston's most feared divorce attorneys. "I wouldn't," she said quietly, "unless you want assault charges added to everything else." The guests at my birthday party had transformed from celebrants to spectators, watching with horrified fascination as my 15-year marriage imploded before their eyes. Craig's business partner, Marcus, edged toward the door, phone already in hand, no doubt preparing to alert their board members about the unfolding catastrophe. "You can't do this," Craig said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "The company employs over 200 people. This isn't just about us." I tilted my head, studying him with genuine curiosity. "Interesting that you suddenly care about collateral damage. Did you consider those 200 employees when you were falsifying quarterly reports? Or when you diverted company funds to set Vanessa up in that charming Beacon Hill apartment?" Vanessa's triumphant smile had completely vanished now, replaced by growing apprehension. "What reports? Craig told me the company was exceeding projections." She turned to him, her hand still protectively covering her belly. "You said we were financially secure." "We are," Craig insisted, loosening his custom-made Italian tie as beads of sweat formed on his forehead. "Rebecca is just trying to scare you." I sighed, setting my champagne flute down on the marble-topped side table, the one we'd found together at that little antique shop in Paris on our 10th anniversary. "Your faith in him is touching, Vanessa, if misplaced. But don't worry. Unlike my husband, I come prepared with evidence." Eleanor handed me a slim tablet. With a few quick taps, I sent the display from the device to our wall-mounted screen, replacing the image of the Meridian Tech building with a series of financial spreadsheets and email exchanges. For anyone interested in the finer details, I announced to the room, these are the actual financial reports for Meridian Tech over the past 18 months. Not the glossy versions sent to shareholders, but the real numbers showing a company hemorrhaging cash due to failed product launches and mismanagement. Craig's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his recently tightened skin. Another expense he'd hidden from me, along with Vanessa's Range Rover and designer wardrobe. I'd discovered the receipt for his cosmetic procedures the same day I'd found evidence of his offshore accounts. How did you get those? His voice had shifted from desperate to dangerous. I smiled, remembering the late nights I'd spent learning about corporate espionage from Eleanor's investigator friend, a former FBI agent who'd taught me how to access Craig's password-protected files. Let's just say you should have changed your passwords after our anniversary. You know, the one you missed because you were in Newport with Vanessa. Your mother's maiden name and birth year aren't exactly Fort Knox. My mother stepped forward. From the stunned crowd, her face a mixture of pride and concern. Rebecca, perhaps we should ask your guests to give you some privacy. Absolutely not, I replied, my voice firm but kind. Everyone here was invited to witness my milestone birthday. They should stay for the whole show. I turned back to our captive audience. Besides, what happens next concerns many of you too, especially those who invested in Meridian Tech on Craig's recommendation. That sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. At least a dozen of our friends had put substantial sums into Craig's company over the years, trusting his confident predictions and seemingly impeccable business acumen. Vanessa had moved away from Craig now, her earlier confidence replaced by growing uncertainty. I don't understand what's happening, she said, her voice small. You promised me everything was taken care of. He promised me that too, I replied, genuine sympathy coloring my voice despite everything. 29 is young, Vanessa. I was 25 when I met Craig, young enough to believe in fairy tales about brilliant entrepreneurs who could do no wrong. I glanced at my soon-to-be ex-husband. The difference is, I've had 15 years to learn exactly who he really is. Craig's eyes narrowed. That's enough, Rebecca. You've made your point. We can discuss the building lease privately. There's no need to air all this dirty laundry. Dirty laundry? I laughed, the sound genuine despite the circumstances. Is that what you call systematic fraud? Misdirection of company funds? And lying to federal regulators? Because the SEC has a different term for it. I held up my phone, displaying a recent email. They call it securities fraud, and they're very interested in the documentation I've provided them. The color drained completely from Craig's face. For the first time since I'd met him, he appeared truly frightened. His eyes darted to the nearest exit, his fight-or-flight response visibly activating. You contacted the SEC? He whispered, horrified. Not just the SEC, I corrected him gently. The documents are also with the State Attorney General's office, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and, I paused for effect, every major business publication that's ever written a glowing profile about Boston's wunderkind tech CEO. Marcus, Craig's right-hand man and co-founder, had stopped inching toward the door and was now openly staring at me with something approaching respect. He'd been the one to warn me years ago, in a rare moment of drunken honesty at a company holiday party, that Craig would sacrifice anyone to get ahead. How long have you known? Craig demanded, his composed facade completely shattered now. I smiled, remembering the exact moment 6 months ago when I'd discovered the first discrepancy, a bank statement accidentally delivered to our home instead of his office, showing transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. Long enough to ensure I had everything in order before making my move. Unlike you, I believe in thorough preparation. Eleanor stepped forward again, handing me another document from her briefcase. Speaking of preparation, this seems like an appropriate moment to serve you formally. She turned to Craig, her professional demeanor firmly in place. Craig Westlake, consider yourself served with divorce papers. You'll find the terms non-negotiable, as they include evidence of financial misconduct that would be made public should you contest them. The elegant envelope seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in Craig's hands as he stared at it in disbelief. Around us, guests were beginning to whisper among themselves, phones discreetly emerging to share the unfolding drama with the outside world. Vanessa had backed up against the fireplace, her earlier triumph completely evaporated. "Craig, what is she talking about? What fraud?" I turned to her, almost pitying her now. "Did he promise you'd be taken care of no matter what? That his company was solid? That there was nothing to worry about?" I shook my head slowly. "He told me those same things 15 years ago. The difference is, I eventually stopped believing him and started verifying." The catering staff hovered uncertainly near the kitchen doorway, the elaborate 3-tiered birthday cake I'd specially commissioned still waiting for its grand entrance. My best friend Sophia caught my eye from across the room and gave a subtle nod, the signal that confirmed everything was proceeding according to our carefully orchestrated plan. "Rebecca," Craig said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone he'd always used when trying to manipulate me privately. "Let's discuss this like rational adults. Whatever you think you've found—" "Found?" I interrupted, my voice carrying just enough to ensure everyone heard. "Like your hidden Cayman accounts? Or the falsified FDA submission for your flagship medical device? Or perhaps you mean the real estate holdings purchased with embezzled company funds?" I turned to Vanessa, whose face had grown increasingly pale. "Did he promise you a house on Nantucket? Because I found those plans too. Quite lovely, actually. The nursery design was particularly thoughtful." Vanessa's hand trembled as she reached for the nearest chair to steady herself. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You said those were legitimate business investments." Craig moved toward her, but Marcus unexpectedly stepped between them. The tension between the two men, business partners for over a decade, was suddenly palpable. "Is it true?" Marcus demanded. His normally affable demeanor hardened into something dangerous. "The FDA documentation. Did you falsify clinical trial data?" Craig's eyes narrowed. "This isn't the time or place." "Answer the question," Marcus insisted, his voice rising. "We have investors in this room. People who put their trust and money in us based on your assurances about the safety data." I watched the confrontation with detached curiosity, like observing specimens in a lab. Eleanor had warned me this might happen, that once the first domino fell, others would follow in rapid succession. Craig's entire carefully constructed world wasn't just cracking, it was shattering. "The trial results were inconclusive," Craig finally admitted, his words chosen with extreme care. "I made a judgment call to emphasize the positive outcomes." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Dr. Jameson, one of Craig's earliest investors, and a respected cardiologist stepped forward, his face ashen. "Those devices are in patients, Craig. Real people. My patients." If you're just joining us, make sure to subscribe right now because tomorrow we'll reveal how I discovered the actual medical data that Craig had been hiding and the devastating consequences his medical device has already had on unsuspecting patients. I moved to the center of the room, commanding attention without raising my voice, a skill I'd learned during my years running the charitable foundation that Craig had always dismissed as my hobby. Craig's phone began ringing, the first of what would undoubtedly be hundreds of panicked calls as news of Meridian Tech's impending implosion spread through Boston's tight-knit business community. He glanced at the screen, his face paling further. "That would be your board chairman," I noted. "He received the complete documentation packet approximately 20 minutes ago. I suspect he has some rather urgent questions about the company's financial statements." The elegant living room of our Westlake estate had transformed into something resembling a crisis command center. Guests who moments earlier had been sipping champagne and exchanging pleasant conversation were now huddled in tense groups, their phones illuminated as they frantically made calls or searched for information about their Meridian Tech investments. The catering staff had wisely retreated to the kitchen, the birthday cake forgotten amid the unfolding catastrophe. Craig jabbed at his phone with trembling fingers, declining the board chairman's call before turning to face me with renewed desperation. "You've had your revenge. Now tell me exactly what you've done." His voice had lost all its usual smooth authority, replaced by barely controlled panic. "I'd be happy to walk you through it step by step," I replied, my tone almost professorial. I gestured toward the display screen still showing the damning financial records. "Let's start with how I discovered your deception, shall we? It might be educational for everyone." Eleanor retrieved yet another document from her seemingly bottomless briefcase and handed it to me, a credit card statement dating back 6 months. I held it up for everyone to see. The first thread that unraveled everything was this American Express bill, accidentally delivered to our home instead of your office. Most wives might have ignored the charges for La Perla lingerie or reservations. At the Four Seasons, items clearly not meant for me since we hadn't been intimate in over a year. I paused, letting the revelation sink in. But I was more interested in these charges here. Consulting fees to Westlake Innovations, a company I'd never heard of despite bearing our family name. Marcus stepped closer, examining the document, with growing horror. "Westlake Innovations? That's the shell company you said was handling our Asia-Pacific patents." I nodded. Except it wasn't handling patents at all. It was Craig's personal slush fund, established in the Caymans 3 years ago and funded directly through inflated consulting invoices to Meridian Tech. I advanced to the next slide on the screen, displaying banking records. Once I had that first thread, it was remarkable how quickly the entire tapestry came apart. Craig made a sudden movement toward the door, but 2 men I'd never introduced to the party guests smoothly intercepted him. They'd been posing as additional catering staff all evening, strategically positioned near exits. One of them discreetly flashed a badge that made Craig freeze in his tracks. "I wouldn't recommend leaving just yet," I advised him calmly. "These gentlemen from the Financial Crimes Division have some questions, and they've been kind enough to wait until my presentation concludes before taking you in for a formal interview." A collective murmur of shock rippled through the room. This had escalated beyond a marital dispute or even a corporate scandal. We were witnessing an actual federal investigation unfolding in real time. Vanessa had sunk into the nearest chair, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Federal? Agents, criminal charges?" Her voice was barely above a whisper as she stared at Craig with dawning comprehension. "What have you done?" A better question might be, what hasn't he done? I replied, advancing to the next document on screen, a detailed timeline I'd constructed over months of investigation. Securities fraud, wire fraud, misappropriation of company funds, filing false statements with federal regulators, and potentially most serious, knowingly distributing medical devices with falsified safety data. Dr. Jameson stepped forward again, his distinguished face grave. "Those devices are in thousands of patients, Craig. People trusted their lives to that technology." "The devices work," Craig insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The clinical results were just enhanced to speed up the approval process." "Enhanced?" Dr. Jameson echoed incredulously. "You mean fabricated? There's a world of difference." I advanced to the next slide, internal emails between Craig and the clinical research team, with key passages highlighted. According to these communications, the device failure rate in initial trials was nearly 12%, not the 0.3% reported to the FDA. Craig personally directed the research team to exclude certain outlier cases from the final submission. The room fell completely silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about lives potentially put at risk through deliberate deception. "How did you get those emails?" Craig demanded, his face ashen. "Those were on secure servers." I smiled, remembering the late nights spent with the cybersecurity specialist Eleanor had introduced me to, a former black hat hacker now working with federal authorities. It's amazing what people will help you discover when they learn lives are at stake. Your IT security chief was particularly helpful after I showed him the preliminary evidence. Apparently, he has a mother with one of your devices implanted. Vanessa stood suddenly, one hand braced against her lower back to support the weight of her pregnancy. I need to understand something, she said, her voice stronger now as she addressed Craig directly. When we met, you told me you were essentially separated, that your marriage existed on paper only. You said Rebecca was financially secure independently and wouldn't be hurt by our relationship. I laughed softly, truly amused by the familiar storyline. Let me guess. He told you I was cold, uninterested in intimacy, focused only on my charity, work instead of supporting his vision? At Vanessa's startled expression, I nodded. He used the same narrative with Sarah from Legal 3 years ago, and probably with others I never discovered. How can you be so calm? Vanessa demanded, tears forming in her eyes. Doesn't any of this hurt you? The question caught me off guard with its genuineness. For a moment, the carefully constructed mask of control I'd maintained all evening slipped, revealing something raw underneath. Of course it hurt. Finding out the man I'd built a life with was systematically betraying not just me, but hundreds of investors, employees, and patients. I shook my head slowly. But pain can be channeled into purpose. Mine became ensuring justice, not just for me, but for everyone he deceived. One of the federal agents checked his watch and moved forward. Mr. Westlake, we need to continue this conversation downtown. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Craig's shoulders slumped as the reality of his situation finally seemed to sink in. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, charismatic CEO had crumbled completely, revealing the desperate, cornered man beneath. The building, he said suddenly, looking up at me with a flicker of his old calculating expression. You said you control the building. We can make a deal. The company still has value. The intellectual property alone is largely based on fraudulent research, I finished for him. But you're right about one thing. The building remains valuable real estate. In fact, I've already had inquiries from several legitimate biotech firms interested in leasing the space once Meridian Tech is evicted. Marcus, who had been frantically texting for the past several minutes, looked up sharply. Evicted? You can't. Just throw 200 employees out on the street. I turned to him with genuine empathy. The employees will be taken care of. My ownership of the building gives me leverage to ensure that. The restructuring plan I've developed with financial advisors includes provisions for retaining all non-executive staff during the transition to new management. For the first time all evening, Marcus appeared momentarily relieved. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've had 6 months to prepare, I reminded him. While Craig was shopping for beachfront property and planning nurseries, I was ensuring that the innocent people caught in his web would land on their feet. As the federal agents began reciting Craig's Miranda rights, I finally looked directly at my husband of 15 years. The man I'd once believed would change the world for the better with his brilliant mind and innovative vision. Now he stood, revealed as nothing more than a common fraud, his apparent success built on deception and betrayal. The irony, I said quietly, just between us as the agents prepared to escort him out, is that you could have actually been everything you pretended to be. You have the intelligence, the charisma, the vision. You just lacked the character to do it honestly. For a moment, Craig's mask slipped completely. Behind the panic and calculation in his eyes, I caught a glimpse of something I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability, perhaps even shame. It vanished almost instantly, replaced by the calculating expression I'd grown so familiar with during our marriage. This isn't over, he muttered as the agents firmly guided him toward the door. You've overplayed your hand, Rebecca. There are contingencies you don't know about. I smiled serenely, thinking of the extensive dossier my investigators had compiled. Documents, secured in multiple locations, Copies already in the hands of authorities and journalists. I'm counting on it, darling. Each new contingency you reveal will only strengthen the case against you. As Craig was escorted from the room, an uncomfortable silence fell over the remaining guests. The carefully orchestrated birthday celebration had transformed into something none of them had anticipated witnessing. The public dismantling of a man many had admired and trusted with their investments, their medical care, their friendship. Dr. Jameson cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence. "I'd like to see those clinical trial documents," he said, his voice tight with professional concern. "I need to know exactly what risks my patients are facing." "Of course," I agreed, nodding to Eleanor. "My sister has prepared comprehensive packets for all medical professionals affected by this situation. The full data set from the original trials, not the sanitized version Craig submitted to regulators." Sophia approached, champagne flute still in hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and admiration. "You planned all of this down to the minute, didn't you? Even Vanessa's dramatic announcement." I glanced toward Vanessa, who sat alone now, looking shell-shocked as she absently rubbed her pregnant belly. "Not exactly. I knew about their relationship, of course, and suspected she might make some sort of scene tonight given Craig's flair for theatrical timing. But the pregnancy announcement was actually a surprise." I smiled thinly. "A convenient one, as it happens. It made everything so much more cinematic." Marcus approached hesitantly, his expression still stunned. "The company. Can it be saved? There are legitimate projects, real innovations that could help people." "That depends on how deep the fraud goes," I replied honestly. "My forensic accountants have identified the most problematic areas, but it will take months to fully separate the legitimate research from the fabricated results." I met his gaze directly. "What I can promise is that any truly valuable innovations will be preserved. The building lease guarantees me significant leverage in how the company is restructured." Across the room, my mother was quietly speaking with Vanessa, her hand resting gently on the younger woman's shoulder. Despite everything, my mother's inherent kindness was asserting itself. She had always been incapable of seeing someone in distress without offering comfort. "You're being remarkably generous to the woman who was planning to replace you," Eleanor observed, following my gaze. I shrugged slightly. "Vanessa is hardly the first woman Craig has manipulated, nor would she have been the last. Her primary crime was ambition and poor judgment in men, hardly capital offenses." I paused, watching as my mother handed Vanessa a tissue. "Besides, there's an innocent child involved now. My issues are with Craig, not his unborn baby." The federal agents who had remained behind approached, their expressions professional but respectful. "Mrs. Westlake, we'll need your formal statement tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at the federal building." "I'll be there," I assured them, "and I'll bring the additional documentation we discussed." As the agents departed, several guests began making discreet exits, murmuring awkward birthday wishes as they slipped away. The evening that had begun as a milestone celebration had evolved into something far more consequential. The beginning of what would undoubtedly become one of Boston's most significant corporate fraud cases. Sophia linked her arm through mine, guiding me toward the relative privacy of the kitchen. "Are you really okay?" she asked quietly, once we were out of earshot. "And don't give me the polished, 'I'm perfectly fine' response you've been serving to everyone else." I leaned against the marble countertop, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 6 months. The sleepless nights spent combing through financial records, the consultations with investigators, the careful construction of an airtight case while maintaining a facade of ignorance around Craig. I searched for the right word. Resolute. Seeing this through to the end isn't just about my marriage anymore. There are patients with potentially dangerous devices, investors who trusted Craig with their life savings, employees whose careers hang in the balance. Sophia studied me with the insight of a 20-year friendship. That's not what I asked. Beyond the responsibility and the justice, How are you feeling about all of this? About Craig? About the baby? The direct question caught me slightly off guard. I'd been so focused on the mechanics of exposing Craig's fraud that I'd carefully compartmentalized my personal feelings about his betrayal. The man I married died years ago, I said finally, surprising myself with the raw honesty. Perhaps he never existed except in my imagination. The brilliant visionary entrepreneur I fell in love with was always more performance than reality. Tonight didn't break my heart. It just confirmed what I've known for years. The kitchen door swung open as Eleanor entered, her expression grave. Marcus is fielding calls from panicked board members. Apparently, trading of Meridian tech stock has been suspended pending investigation. She glanced at her watch. And the first news vans just pulled up outside. The story's breaking faster than we anticipated. I straightened, smoothing the fabric of my designer dress, specifically chosen for its photogenic qualities. Well then, I suppose it's time for phase 2. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Phase 2? There's more? Of course, I replied, checking my appearance in the reflection of a stainless steel refrigerator door. Craig's arrest is just the beginning. Now comes the part where we ensure that everyone affected by his fraud receives justice. The patients, the investors, the employees. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Your interview with the Boston Globe is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, after your statement to the federal investigators. The reporter has already received the background documentation, so she'll be well prepared to ask substantive questions. Perfect, I said, mentally reviewing the key points I wanted to emphasize in the media narrative. And the patient advocacy groups? Already mobilizing, Eleanor confirmed. Dr. Jameson has agreed to lead the medical response team, identifying affected patients, coordinating with other physicians, developing monitoring protocols for those with the questionable devices. I turned back to Sophia, who was watching our exchange with growing amazement. See? Phase 2. Ensuring that Craig can't use his considerable charm and connections to minimize or escape the consequences of his actions. The court of public opinion can be as important as the actual legal proceedings. Sophia shook her head slowly. I knew you were methodical, but this is next-level chess while everyone else is playing checkers. A soft knock at the kitchen door interrupted us. My mother entered, her expression concerned. Rebecca, that poor girl is in quite a state. Whatever Craig told her about their future together clearly didn't include federal indictments and corporate collapse. I sighed, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions regarding Vanessa. I suppose I should speak with her. Where is she now? In the guest bathroom, trying to compose herself, my mother replied. She seems genuinely shocked by everything that's happened. I nodded, steeling myself for what would undoubtedly be an uncomfortable conversation. Eleanor, can you handle the remaining guests? Answer questions, distribute the information packets to anyone who hasn't received them yet. Eleanor squeezed my arm reassuringly. Of course. Take your time. As I navigated the hallway toward the guest bathroom, I passed the elegant dining room where my birthday cake still waited on a silver stand, 40 candles arranged in a graceful spiral, never to be lit. The sight struck me as an apt metaphor for the evening. Carefully planned celebrations abandoned in favor of unexpected truths. I knocked gently on the bathroom door. Vanessa? It's Rebecca. I think we should talk. A long silence followed my knock, broken only by the faint sound of muffled sobbing from the other side of the door. Finally, I heard the lock click, and the door opened to reveal Vanessa standing there, her carefully applied makeup now streaked with tears, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine distress. Why would you want to talk to me? She asked, her voice hoarse. I tried to humiliate you in front of all your friends and family. I stepped into the spacious guest bathroom, closing the door behind me to give us privacy from the curious eyes of lingering party guests. The irony wasn't lost on me, seeking private conversation with my husband's mistress in my own home, on my birthday no less. Believe it or not, you did me a favor tonight, I said, perching on the edge of the marble vanity while Vanessa leaned against the opposite wall. Your announcement accelerated the timeline. I was planning to wait until the SEC filing next week, but this worked out rather elegantly. Vanessa stared at me, confusion evident through her tear-stained expression. You're not angry about the baby? About Craig and me? I considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, when I'd first discovered evidence of their affair, I had, indeed, experienced a flash of rage, not because I still loved Craig, but because of the sheer audacity of their deception. My own personal assistant in my home, wearing my clothes, using my resources, while systematically helping dismantle my marriage. I stopped loving Craig years ago, I admitted, surprising myself with the candor. The man I married was brilliant, visionary, passionate about changing the world through innovation. But somewhere along the way, that man disappeared. Or perhaps he never truly existed except in my imagination. The Craig you know is just a shell filled with ambition and entitlement. Vanessa slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her designer dress pooling around her, one hand protectively cradling her pregnant belly. He told me you were cold, career-obsessed, that you didn't support his vision or understand the pressures he was under. I couldn't help but laugh, a genuine, if bitter, sound. Classic Craig. He used the same narrative with Sarah from Legal 3 years ago, probably with others I never discovered. I studied Vanessa's face, seeing not a rival now, but another victim of Craig's manipulations. Tell me, when did he start suggesting that you make minor adjustments to financial reports? Or ask you to route certain documents through your personal email rather than company servers? The shock on her face confirmed my suspicions. How did you know about that? Because it's his pattern, I explained. Craig doesn't just groom women for affairs, he grooms accomplices, creates smaller and smaller ethical compromises until you're so implicated in his schemes that exposure would destroy your career along with his. Vanessa pressed her palms against her eyes, smudging her makeup further. The foundation transfers, she whispered. He said they were legitimate charitable donations, but the documentation was always rushed, incomplete. When I questioned it, he said you handled the charity end and I shouldn't worry about the details. I nodded, having already uncovered those particular transactions during my investigation. Meridian Tech's charitable contributions to literacy programs in Southeast Asia? Those went directly to shell companies manufacturing counterfeit components for the medical devices. The paper trail leads right through accounts you personally managed. Oh God, Vanessa moaned, the full implications hitting her. I could go to prison. I signed those transfer authorizations. You could, I agreed, watching her carefully. Or you could cooperate fully with the investigation. Demonstrate that. You were manipulated by a controlling executive who deliberately kept you in the dark about the true nature of the transactions. Hope flickered briefly in her eyes. You'd help me, after everything? I reached into the small evening bag I'd been carrying and withdrew a business card, handing it to her. This is the contact information for Patricia Winters. She's a former federal prosecutor who now specializes in representing cooperating witnesses in white-collar crime cases. Eleanor arranged for her to take your case, assuming you're willing to provide complete testimony about everything you witnessed at Meridian Tech. Vanessa took the card with trembling fingers, staring at it as though it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Why would you do this for me? I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress. Partially because your testimony will help ensure Craig faces the full consequences of his actions. Primarily because there's an innocent child involved who deserves at least one parent not serving federal prison time. Through the bathroom door, we could hear increasing commotion in the main part of the house. Raised voices, the distinctive sound of professional camera equipment being assembled. The media had arrived even faster than Eleanor had anticipated. What happens now? Vanessa asked, struggling to rise from her seated position on the floor. I extended my hand automatically, helping her to her feet. Now you have some difficult decisions to make, I told her honestly. The authorities already have most of the evidence they need to build their case against Craig and his executive team. Your testimony would simply strengthen it, potentially reducing your own exposure in exchange for cooperation. Vanessa stared at her reflection in the mirror, wiping ineffectually at her ruined makeup. Everything he promised was a lie, wasn't it? The house on Nantucket, the trust fund for the baby, the bright future together once you were out of the picture. Craig's specialty is selling beautiful illusions, I confirmed, feeling a strange kinship with this woman who had experienced the same painful awakening I had undergone years earlier. He's remarkably skilled at identifying exactly what someone wants to hear, then crafting a narrative that seems to offer it. A sharp knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Eleanor's voice came through clearly. "Rebecca?" The Boston Globe reporter is here, along with Channel 5 News. They're requesting an immediate statement given the developing situation. I checked my appearance in the mirror one final time, straightening my shoulders and adopting the composed expression I'd practiced for this moment. "I'll be right there," I called back. Turning to Vanessa, I offered what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "You're welcome to use the rear entrance if you'd prefer to avoid the media. My driver can take you wherever you need to go." Vanessa looked up from the business card she'd been studying, her expression shifting from despair to something resembling resolve. "No," she said quietly. "I think I need to start facing reality, no matter how uncomfortable. Craig won't be there. For this baby, he'll likely be in prison when it's born. I need to start making better decisions." I felt a surprising surge of respect for her in that moment. "Call Attorney Winters tonight," I advised. "The first 48 hours will be critical in establishing your status as a cooperating witness rather than a target of the investigation." As we exited the bathroom together, we were greeted by the sight of television cameras being set up in my elegant living room. Journalists conferring in hushed tones with their producers. Eleanor efficiently directing traffic like the skilled legal commander she was. My birthday party had transformed into an impromptu press conference, the opening salvo in what would soon become Boston's most significant financial fraud case in decades. Marcus approached, his expression grave. "The board has called an emergency meeting for 6 a.m. Trading of our stock will remain suspended indefinitely. The company..." He trailed off, seemingly unable to complete the thought. "The company will survive in some form," I assured him, genuinely believing it. "The legitimate innovations, the honest researchers, the dedicated employees, they'll weather this storm. Meridian Tech won't disappear, it will transform." He studied me with new respect, perhaps seeing for the first time the strategic mind that Craig had always dismissed as merely detail-oriented. "You've planned for every contingency, haven't you?" I smiled, thinking of the exhaustive scenario modeling I'd conducted with financial and legal experts over the past 6 months. Not every contingency, but certainly the most likely outcomes, including a transition plan for the company that preserves as many jobs as possible while excising the fraudulent elements. Eleanor appeared at my side, all business efficiency. "They're ready for your statement whenever you are. Just the key points we discussed: confirmation of Craig's arrest, emphasis on cooperation with authorities, focus on protecting patients, investors, and employees. No specifics about pending charges." I nodded, taking a deep breath as I prepared to step before the cameras. This moment represented not just the culmination of months of careful planning, but a public reclaiming of my own narrative. No longer would I be seen as the oblivious corporate wife, the society hostess who turned a blind eye to her husband's indiscretions. After tonight, Boston, and soon the world, would understand exactly who Rebecca Westlake truly was. "I'm ready," I told Eleanor, and stepped forward to face the waiting press. The camera lights blazed with artificial brightness, transforming my tastefully decorated living room into an impromptu press studio. I stood before the assembled journalists with the poise I'd cultivated through years of chairing charity galas and foundation board meetings, events Craig had always dismissed as frivolous society obligations, rather than the strategic networking. Opportunities they truly were. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "My name is Rebecca Westlake. As some of you already know, federal authorities have taken my husband, Craig Westlake, into custody this evening on suspicion of multiple financial crimes related to his role as CEO of Meridian Tech." Cameras clicked rapidly, recording every nuance of my expression as I continued with the carefully prepared statement. "While I cannot comment on the specifics of the ongoing investigation, I can confirm that I have been cooperating with federal authorities for the past 6 months, providing documentation related to potentially fraudulent activities at Meridian Tech. These include, but are not limited to, securities fraud, wire fraud, misappropriation of company funds, and most seriously, falsification of clinical trial data for medical devices currently in use throughout the country." A reporter from the Boston Globe raised her hand. "Mrs. Westlake, can you clarify your relationship to Meridian Tech? Were you an employee or officer of the company?" "I have never held an official position at Meridian Tech," I explained. "My involvement began when I accidentally discovered financial irregularities that suggested criminal activity. As a matter of conscience, I felt obligated to investigate further and ultimately bring this information to the proper authorities." A television reporter jumped in before I could continue. "Is it true that you now control the building where Meridian Tech is headquartered? How does that factor into this situation?" I nodded, appreciating the directness of the question. 6 months ago, as part of my investigation, I discovered that the real estate holding company that owns the Meridian Tech headquarters building was seeking additional investors. Through careful financial planning, I was able to acquire majority ownership of that holding company, which gives me significant leverage in ensuring that the hundreds of innocent employees at Meridian Tech don't suffer unnecessarily for the actions of a few executives. Murmurs rippled through the assembled press corps as they processed this information. Another reporter raised his hand. "Mrs. Westlake, sources tell us that Craig Westlake's mistress announced her pregnancy and their engagement at your birthday party tonight just before his arrest. Was this confrontation intentionally staged?" Eleanor stepped forward slightly, prepared to deflect the personal question, but I placed a gentle hand on her arm. This narrative element was too powerful to sidestep. It would humanize the story, make it relatable beyond the complex financial crimes at its center. "The timing was not of my choosing," I replied with measured candor. "I had planned to wait until the SEC filing next week before making any of this public. However, when Vanessa Blake, my former personal assistant, chose to make her announcement at my birthday celebration, it accelerated the timeline. Federal agents were already monitoring the situation and made the decision to take Craig into custody tonight rather than next week as originally planned." A reporter from the Wall Street Journal pressed further. "So your husband's mistress inadvertently triggered the timing of his arrest by choosing your birthday party for her announcement?" I allowed myself a small, restrained smile. Life has a certain poetry sometimes, doesn't it? But to be clear, Craig's arrest was inevitable given the evidence against him. The timing was merely accelerated by tonight's events. On the periphery of the media scrum, I noticed Vanessa standing quietly, watching the proceedings with a shell-shocked expression. Despite everything, I felt a surprising surge of empathy for her. She had been a willing participant in the affair, certainly, but Craig had a proven pattern of manipulating younger women, drawing them into his schemes until they were too compromised to extricate themselves. I'd like to emphasize that my primary concern going forward is for the patients who may have received medical devices with falsified safety data, I continued, redirecting the conversation to the most critical aspect of the case. Dr. William Jameson, one of Boston's leading cardiologists, has agreed to head a medical response team that will coordinate with healthcare providers nationwide to identify affected patients and develop appropriate monitoring protocols. Dr. Jameson stepped forward at my gesture, his distinguished presence adding gravity to the proceedings. We've already begun analyzing the actual clinical trial data versus what was submitted to regulators, he explained. While we don't want to create unnecessary panic, transparency is essential. Patients deserve to know the true performance metrics of devices implanted in their bodies. I noticed several reporters scribbling furiously at this revelation. The human impact of Craig's fraud would undoubtedly become a major focus of media coverage in the coming days. Additionally, I continued, I want to address the hundreds of Meridian Tech employees who had no knowledge of or involvement in the fraudulent activities. These dedicated scientists, engineers, and support staff have been working in good faith to develop technologies that improve lives. They shouldn't suffer because of the actions of a corrupt executive team. Marcus stepped forward at this point, aligning himself visibly with me rather than with his longtime business partner. As co-founder and chief innovation officer, I want to assure our employees that we will be working closely with Mrs. Westlake and the authorities to ensure continuity of operations for legitimate projects. While there will undoubtedly be a difficult transition period, our goal is to preserve as many jobs as possible. His statement sent a clear message to everyone watching. The company was already reorganizing, distancing itself from Craig even as the investigation was just beginning. It was a strategic move I had anticipated but not orchestrated. Marcus was making a calculated decision to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his partnership with Craig. A young reporter from a tech industry publication raised her hand. Mrs. Westlake, you mentioned owning the building that houses Meridian Tech. Are you planning to evict the company? Not at all, I assured her. My ownership of the building gives me leverage to ensure an orderly transition that protects innocent employees and legitimate research. I have no interest in creating additional casualties from this situation. My goal is justice, not vengeance. Eleanor checked her watch discreetly and gave me a subtle nod, the signal that we had covered the essential points and should conclude before the questioning veered into territory that could compromise the legal proceedings. I'll take one final question, I announced, gesturing to an older journalist I recognized as having covered Boston's business community for decades. Mrs. Westlake, given the scope of the alleged fraud and the potential impact on patients with Meridian devices, do you have any regrets about how you handled this situation? Could you have come forward sooner? The question struck at a moral complexity I had wrestled with throughout my investigation. I took a moment before responding, wanting my answer to reflect the genuine ethical considerations rather than offering a polished deflection. When I first discovered financial irregularities, I had no idea how deep the fraud went or that patient safety might be compromised, I explained carefully. Building a comprehensive understanding of the situation took time that allowed me to ensure the evidence was irrefutable and that protective measures could be put in place for all affected parties. Had I understood from the beginning that medical devices with falsified safety data were involved, my approach and timeline would have been different. That knowledge came later in my investigation. It was the most honest answer I could give without compromising the legal case or revealing the personal journey that had led me from suspicious wife to financial investigator. Thank you all for your attention, I concluded. Additional information will be provided through proper channels as the legal process moves forward. For now, I ask that you respect the privacy of everyone affected by this situation, particularly the employees of Meridian Tech who are learning about these developments at the same time you are. As the press conference concluded, I caught Vanessa's eye across the room. In that brief exchange of glances, something unspoken passed between us, a recognition of shared manipulation at the hands of a master deceiver, and perhaps a tentative acknowledgement that both of us were now navigating the aftermath of his betrayal in our own ways. Eleanor appeared at my side as the journalists began packing up their equipment. That went as well as could be expected, she murmured. The patient safety angle will dominate the coverage, which keeps the focus where it belongs, on the public impact rather than the personal drama. I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the evening's events. What had begun as a milestone birthday celebration had transformed into something far more consequential, the first chapter in what would undoubtedly become one of Boston's most significant corporate fraud cases. And somewhere in a federal holding facility, Craig was beginning to comprehend that the wife he had underestimated for years had orchestrated his downfall with a precision that would have impressed even him. The morning after my spectacularly derailed birthday party dawned bright and clear, the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of my home office as I prepared for my formal statement to federal investigators. The house felt strangely empty without the constant background presence of Craig. His early morning conference calls, the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard, the perpetual coffee cup rings he left on every surface, despite the coasters I strategically placed throughout our home. Eleanor arrived promptly at 7, carrying a leather portfolio and the steely determination that had made her one of Boston's most formidable attorneys. She found me already dressed in a conservative navy suit, reviewing the chronology of evidence we had meticulously assembled over the past 6 months. "You've made the front page of every major newspaper in the country," she announced, spreading several publications across my desk. The headlines varied in their specific focus, but all captured the essential drama of the previous evening. Tech CEO arrested at wife's birthday party amid fraud allegations. Medical device scandal rocks. Boston's biotech community. Corporate fraud and personal betrayal, the fall of Craig Westlake. Most featured photos of Craig being escorted from our home by federal agents, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. Several included images of me at the impromptu press conference, my composure intact despite the extraordinary circumstances. The BA market is responding, Eleanor continued, pulling up financial data on her tablet. Meridian Tech stock was suspended from trading yesterday, but related biotech stocks are down across the board. The industry is bracing for regulatory backlash. I nodded, having anticipated this ripple effect. What about patient response? Have there been any reports of panic from those with Meridian devices? Dr. Jameson has been coordinating with hospitals since 5 this morning, Eleanor replied. They've established a dedicated hotline and are prioritizing outreach to patients with the most recently approved devices, those most likely to have been subject to falsified data. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus. I put it on speaker so Eleanor could hear. Rebecca? I'm at headquarters with what's left of the executive team. The FBI arrived at dawn with search warrants. They're imaging servers, seizing documents. It's exactly as you predicted. His voice sounded strained, the weight of the company's uncertain future evident in every word. How are the employees handling it? I asked, genuinely concerned for the hundreds of innocent researchers, engineers, and support staff caught in the crossfire of Craig's fraud. Better than expected, actually, Marcus replied. Many had suspicions about certain projects but felt powerless to question Craig's directives. There's a strange sense of relief mixed with the anxiety, like they've been carrying a burden they can finally acknowledge. I exchanged glances with Eleanor. This aligned with information we'd gathered from whistleblowers within the company. A culture of fear had prevented many employees from speaking up about questionable practices. What about the legitimate research projects? I pressed. Are they being allowed to continue work on non-compromised products? Yes, the FBI has been surprisingly accommodating on that front. They've isolated the problematic divisions and are allowing routine work to continue in unaffected areas. Marcus paused. Rebecca, I owe you an apology. I should have seen what was happening. Craig and I built this company together, but somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning his decisions, stopped verifying his claims. The admission surprised. I had always viewed Marcus as complicit, if not actively then, at least through willful blindness. Perhaps I had misjudged him. We all missed signs we should have recognized. I replied diplomatically. The important thing now is containing the damage and preserving what's salvageable. After ending the call, I turned to Eleanor. Is Vanessa secured? My sister nodded. Attorney Winters met with her at 6 a.m. She's already providing preliminary statements to federal investigators. Apparently, once she started talking, she couldn't stop. The prosecutor is viewing her as a cooperating witness rather than a target of the investigation. I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Despite everything, I hadn't wanted to see Vanessa face criminal charges. Her greatest crime had been poor judgment in becoming involved with my husband. The financial improprieties she had unwittingly facilitated were Craig's responsibility. And what about Craig's contingencies? I asked, recalling his ominous parting words. Eleanor's expression turned grim. His personal attorney tried to access the offshore accounts early this morning. The feds were waiting. They had been monitoring those accounts since we provided the documentation. The attempt to move funds actually strengthened the case against him. A knock at my office door interrupted our conversation. My mother entered, carrying a tray with coffee and freshly baked scones, her way of providing comfort since I was a child. The caterers are cleaning up the last of the party debris, she informed me, setting down the tray. And I've been fielding calls from concerned friends all morning. Everyone wants to know how you're holding up. I accepted the coffee gratefully. I'm fine, Mother, truly. This is the culmination of months of work. Actually, it's a relief to have everything in the open finally. She studied me with the penetrating gaze that had always seen through my composed facade. It's okay to feel the personal betrayal alongside the professional vindication, you know. What Craig did, the affair, the baby, the public humiliation, those wounds don't disappear just because you've outsmarted him in the end. Her insight struck closer to home than I wanted to admit. While I had channeled my initial hurt into methodical investigation, building an airtight case against Craig had been as much about personal justice as professional ethics. I processed those emotions months ago, I insisted, perhaps too quickly. When I found evidence of the affair, and then discovered it was just the tip of a much larger iceberg of deception, any remaining attachment I felt toward Craig transformed into determination to hold him accountable. My mother didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Well, in any case, you should eat something. You have a long day ahead. As she left, Eleanor checked her watch. We should head downtown. The federal prosecutors want to meet briefly before your formal statement. The drive to the federal building took us through Boston's financial district, past the gleaming Meridian Tech headquarters, the building I now effectively controlled. Television news vans clustered around the entrance, reporters doing live stand-ups with the company logo visible in the background. Employees hurried inside, heads down, avoiding the cameras documenting their employer's spectacular downfall. Strange. To think that this all began with a misdirected credit card statement, I mused, watching the scene through the car window. Eleanor smiled thinly. Most complex frauds unravel from a single loose thread. You just happen to be observant enough to notice it and determined enough to keep pulling. At the federal building, we were escorted to a conference room where a team of prosecutors and investigators awaited. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Catherine Chen, greeted us with professional courtesy. Mrs. Westlake, I want to thank you for your cooperation throughout this investigation. The documentation you provided has been invaluable in building our case. She gestured for us to sit. Before we take your formal statement, I wanted to update you on several developments. I settled into a chair, maintaining the poised demeanor I'd cultivated throughout this ordeal. I appreciate that, Ms. Chen. First, Craig Westlake was formally charged this morning with 27 counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to federal regulators. The judge denied bail given the flight risk and the severity of the charges. She consulted her notes. Second, 3 additional Meridian Tech executives have been taken into custody based partly On information provided by Vanessa Blake, I nodded, having anticipated this cascade effect. Craig had always surrounded himself with loyal lieutenants willing to bend rules on his behalf. And the patient safety concerns? I pressed, focusing on what I considered the most critical aspect of the case. Catherine's expression turned grave. The FDA has initiated an emergency review of all Meridian medical devices approved in the past 5 years. Preliminary analysis suggests that while performance data was exaggerated, most devices aren't presenting immediate safety risks. However, they're establishing enhanced monitoring protocols for patients with the Class 3 devices, those with the most questionable approval data. Relief washed over me. My greatest fear had been that Craig's fraud might have resulted in actively dangerous devices being implanted in unsuspecting patients. That's encouraging news, I acknowledged. Though I imagine the class action lawsuits from patients will proceed regardless. Absolutely, Catherine confirmed, shuffling through her notes. The civil litigation will likely continue for years, but our focus remains on the criminal charges, particularly the deliberate falsification of safety data submitted to federal regulators. For the next 3 hours, I provided a detailed chronological account of my investigation, beginning with the discovery of the misdirected credit card statement and culminating in the previous night's dramatic confrontation. The team of prosecutors and FBI agents listened intently, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions, but mostly allowing me to walk them through the complex web of financial deception I had uncovered. The offshore accounts were the key, I explained, referencing a series of documents Eleanor had organized into color-coded folders. Once I identified the pattern of transfers to shell companies in the Caymans and Singapore, I could trace how company funds were being systematically diverted for personal use and to cover up failing research programs. Special Agent Donovan, a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, nodded appreciatively. The documentation you've provided gives us a complete roadmap of the fraud. In 20 years investigating corporate malfeasance, I've rarely seen such meticulous evidence gathered by a private citizen. I accepted the compliment with a modest nod, though inwardly I felt a surge of validation. The countless sleepless nights spent combing through financial records, the clandestine meetings with industry insiders, the careful cataloging of every suspicious transaction, all had culminated in an airtight case that even Craig's high-powered attorneys would struggle to dismantle. What I still don't understand, Catherine interjected, is how you managed to acquire controlling interest in the building without alerting Craig or his financial team. Surely they would have noticed such a significant transaction. At this, Eleanor smiled slightly. That was perhaps the most elegant aspect of Rebecca's strategy. Would you like to explain, or shall I? I leaned forward, taking quiet satisfaction in revealing this particular maneuver. Westlake Commercial Properties, the company that owns the Meridian Tech building, was established 15 years ago when Craig was first expanding his business. At the time, he asked me to serve as a silent partner, purely for tax purposes, he claimed. I signed the incorporation documents but was never actively involved in its management. Catherine's eyes narrowed with interest. So you were already part owner of the property? Technically, yes, though Craig had been treating it as his exclusive domain for years. What he failed to realize was that the original operating agreement gave me specific rights that he couldn't override without my signature, including the right of first refusal for any new investment shares. Agent Donovan let out a low whistle of appreciation. And when the property needed additional capital for renovations or refinancing? Exactly, I confirmed. 3 months ago, when Craig's financial manipulations had stretched Meridian Tech's resources too thin, he arranged for the property company to seek additional investors rather than drawing more suspicious funds from the company. The offering was structured to dilute existing shareholders, specifically me, while bringing in new capital he could control. But he needed your signature to waive your right of first refusal, Eleanor added, which he attempted to obtain by burying it. in a stack of routine documents he asked you to sign. I smiled at the memory of that particular evening. Craig casually sliding a folder of papers across the breakfast table, mentioning something vague about estate planning updates requiring my signature. Fortunately, I had already begun my investigation by then, and had developed the habit of actually reading everything before signing. Rather than confronting him, I signed the documents, minus the waiver, and then exercised my right to purchase all newly issued shares myself through a separate holding company he knew nothing about. Catherine shook her head in reluctant admiration. So when the new shares were issued, I became majority owner of the building that houses his entire company, I confirmed. Craig was so focused on his affair with Vanessa and covering up the financial fraud that he never noticed the ownership transition until I revealed it last night. As the formal interview concluded, Catherine walked us to the elevator, her expression pensive. You know, Mrs. Westlake, in fraud cases of this magnitude, we typically see spouses claiming complete ignorance, or worse, actively participating in the deception for financial gain. Your actions represent a remarkable third path. I considered her observation as the elevator doors opened. I suppose I simply refused to be either a victim or an accomplice. The moment I discovered Craig's deception, I had a choice to make. I chose justice, not just for myself, but for everyone affected by his fraud. Outside the federal building, a phalanx of reporters had gathered, alerted to my presence by the ever-efficient gossip network that permeated Boston's legal community. Eleanor skillfully guided me through the crowd with minimal comment, promising a more detailed statement at an appropriate time. As we drove back toward Beacon Hill, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Eleanor gestured for me to put it on speaker as she continued navigating the midday traffic. Mrs. Westlake, this is Dr. Lillian Zhao from Massachusetts General Hospital. The woman's voice was professional but carried an undercurrent of urgency. I'm calling because Vanessa Blake has been admitted to our high-risk obstetrics unit. She experienced some concerning symptoms during her interview with federal authorities this morning, and they brought her here as a precaution. I exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor, both of us immediately grasping the potential complications, both medical and legal, this development presented. Is her condition serious? I asked, genuine concern overriding any lingering resentment I might have harbored. Whatever Vanessa's poor choices had been, her unborn child was an innocent party in this drama. She's stabilized, but we're monitoring her closely for signs of preterm labor. The stress of recent events appears to have triggered contractions, though we've managed to suppress them for now. Dr. Zhao hesitated before continuing. The reason I'm calling is that Ms. Blake has listed you as her emergency contact. She said you would understand why she couldn't list Craig Westlake given the circumstances. The irony of this development wasn't lost on me. 24 hours earlier, Vanessa had been triumphantly announcing her pregnancy and engagement to my husband at my birthday party. Now she was reaching out to me as perhaps the only person left in her rapidly shrinking world who might offer assistance without judgment. I understand, I replied, making a quick decision. Please tell Ms. Blake that I'll be there within the hour. And doctor, ensure that no information about her condition is released to the press. The last thing she needs right now is media speculation about her health or the baby's. As Eleanor redirected our route toward Massachusetts General, she gave me a questioning look. You don't owe her anything, Rebecca. In fact, most people would say she deserves whatever consequences come her way. I gazed out the window at the familiar Boston skyline, considering my motivations. This isn't about what Vanessa deserves. It's about who I choose to be in response to all of this. I turned back to my sister. Craig's betrayal could have turned me bitter, vindictive, petty. Instead, I chose to be strategic, measured, just. Extending basic compassion to Vanessa and her unborn child is simply an extension of that choice. Eleanor's expression softened with something resembling pride. Sometimes I forget you're not just the methodical strategist who built an airtight fraud case. You're also the woman who runs 3 different charitable foundations and remembers the names of every maintenance worker in your building. I smiled slightly at her observation. Being underestimated has its advantages. Craig dismissed my charity, work as socialite virtue signaling, rather than recognizing it as valuable experience in organizational management and financial oversight. His blindness to my capabilities was ultimately his undoing. As we approached the hospital, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking. Meridian Tech Board announces emergency restructuring. Marcus Devlin named interim CEO. Attached was a corporate statement indicating that the board had voted unanimously to remove Craig and implement sweeping governance reforms pending the outcome of federal investigations. I showed the alert to Eleanor, who raised an eyebrow. That was faster than anticipated. The board must have decided that distancing themselves from Craig immediately was their only chance of salvaging the company. Marcus is a good choice for the transition, I noted, recalling his evident shock and genuine dismay upon learning the extent of Craig's fraud. He has the technical knowledge without the ethical compromise. The question now is whether the company can survive the legal and regulatory hurricane that's coming. As we pulled into the hospital parking garage, I mentally shifted gears from corporate strategist to the more human role I now needed to play. Whatever complicated history existed between Vanessa and me, at this moment, she was simply a frightened young woman facing the premature birth of her child, while the father sat in a federal detention center. I've arranged for Attorney Winters to meet us here, Eleanor informed me as we entered the hospital. Vanessa still needs to complete her formal statement to the prosecutors, but they've agreed it can be done from her hospital room once she's stabilized. I nodded, appreciating my sister's characteristic thoroughness. As we made our way to the obstetrics floor, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary 24 hours that had transformed my life and the lives of everyone connected to Craig Westlake. The birthday celebration that was supposed to mark my 40th year had instead become a demarcation point between my old life and whatever came next, a future I had yet to fully envision beyond ensuring justice was served. The maternity floor of Massachusetts General Hospital offered a stark contrast to the chaos of the past 24 hours. The hushed corridors, soft lighting, and gentle efficiency of the medical staff created an atmosphere of calm purpose, a reminder that even as corporate empires crumbled and reputations shattered, the fundamental rhythms of life continued undisturbed. Nurse directed us to a private room at the end of the hall, her expression professionally neutral, though I detected a flicker of recognition in her eyes. By now, my face had appeared in every news outlet in Boston, alongside lurid headlines about Craig's arrest and Meridian Tech's implosion. I paused outside Vanessa's door, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of my presence. Perhaps my offer of assistance had been presumptuous. After all, I was the architect of her fiancé's downfall, however justified. Before I could reconsider, the door opened, and Dr. Zhao emerged, looking surprised to find me hesitating in the hallway. "Mrs. Westlake, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, extending her hand. "Ms. Blake has been asking for you. Her condition has stabilized, but we're keeping her under observation for at least the next 24 hours. Is the baby in danger?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "Not immediately, but at 32 weeks, we want to maintain the pregnancy for as long as possible." Dr. Zhao lowered her voice. "The psychological stress is our primary concern at this point. Ms. Blake's blood pressure spiked dangerously during her interview with federal authorities." I nodded, understanding the implications. "I'll ensure she isn't subjected to further questioning until you clear it from a medical perspective." The doctor appeared relieved. "That would be helpful. She seems to believe you have some influence in that regard." "I do," I confirmed simply. Eleanor touched my arm gently. "I'll wait out here and coordinate with Attorney Winters when she arrives. Take whatever time you need." With a deep breath, I entered the hospital room to find Vanessa propped up on pillows, an IV in one arm and a fetal monitor strapped across her swollen belly. The sophisticated young woman who had confidently announced her pregnancy at my birthday party was gone, replaced by a pale, frightened version of herself with smudged makeup and tangled hair. "Rebecca," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You actually came." I moved to the chair beside her bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "Of course I came. How are you feeling? Physically or emotionally?" She attempted a weak smile. "The doctors say the contractions have stopped, but they want to monitor me. Apparently, discovering your fiancé is a criminal facing decades in prison while you're 7 months pregnant isn't recommended prenatal care." Despite everything, I appreciated her attempt at gallows humor. It suggested a resilience I hadn't previously attributed to her. "I've arranged for the federal prosecutors to postpone the remainder of your statement until the doctors clear you," I informed her. "And I've brought Attorney Winters. She's the best at navigating these situations and will ensure your cooperation is properly credited." Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. "Why are you helping me? I tried to humiliate you in front of your friends and family. I was sleeping with your husband. I wore your jewelry and used your credit cards." She gestured helplessly at her stomach. "I'm carrying his child." The raw honesty of her question deserved an equally honest answer. I considered my response carefully. "I'm helping you because you're as much Craig's victim as anyone," I said finally. "Yes, your choices were poor, but Craig has a pattern of identifying vulnerable people and exploiting them for his purposes. He did it to investors, to patients, to employees, and he did it to you." Vanessa's monitor beeped as her heart rate increased slightly. "I should have known," she whispered. "There were signs, documents he asked me to process without proper authorization, meetings that weren't recorded in his official calendar, calls he took in private." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "I ignored all of it because I wanted to believe in the future he promised us." I recognized the painful awakening she was experiencing, the same disillusionment I had undergone years earlier when I first began to glimpse the truth about the man I had married. "Craig is exceptionally skilled at presenting himself as whatever his target needs him to be," I observed. "For investors, he was the brilliant innovator worthy of their millions. For patients, he was the compassionate medical pioneer. For you, he was the misunderstood husband seeking true connection. And for you," Vanessa asked softly, "what was he to you?" The question caught me off guard with its insight. "Initially, he was my intellectual equal, someone who valued my strategic mind when many men were intimidated by it. Later, he became a project, someone I believed I could help reach his full potential ethically as well as professionally." I smiled ruefully. "Eventually, I realized the gap between who Craig pretended to be and who he actually was couldn't be bridged by anyone, least of all a wife he increasingly saw as an impediment to his ambitions." Vanessa adjusted herself against the pillows, wincing slightly as she changed positions. "The federal agents showed me documents, transfer authorizations I'd processed, emails I'd sent on Craig's behalf. They said I could be charged as an accomplice." Fresh fear clouded her expression. "I can't go to prison, not with the baby." "That won't happen," I assured her with more confidence than I actually felt. "Attorney Winters has already negotiated preliminary cooperation terms. Your testimony against Craig is valuable enough that the prosecutors are willing to be lenient, especially given your limited understanding of the fraud." A soft knock at the door interrupted our conversation. A nurse entered with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Blake, we need to run another set of monitoring tests. And," she hesitated, glancing at me, "there's a U.S. Marshal outside requesting a brief word with Mrs. Westlake." I rose, touching Vanessa's hand lightly. "I'll be back after your tests. Try to rest. Stress isn't good for you or the baby." In the hallway, I found not just Eleanor and Attorney Winters, but also a stern-faced U.S. Marshal who introduced himself as Deputy Director Callahan. "Mrs. Westlake, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. he began without preamble. "Your husband has made a request to speak with you. He claims to have information relevant to patient safety that he will only disclose to you personally." Eleanor immediately stepped forward. "Absolutely not. This is clearly a manipulation tactic. Any legitimate safety information can be provided to the proper authorities." Callahan nodded in acknowledgement of her concern. "We've made that same point. However, Mr. Westlake insists that certain safety protocols for devices already implanted in patients are known only to him and were intentionally kept off all documentation to protect proprietary information." I felt a chill at this revelation. It was entirely in character for Craig to have created such a situation, establishing himself as indispensable even after his fraud was exposed. More disturbingly, it was plausible enough to be true. "If there's any chance patient lives are at risk, I need to hear what he has to say," I decided, ignoring Eleanor's warning look. "But I'll meet him on my terms, not his." The Federal Detention Center presented a stark contrast to the luxurious environments Craig had always insisted upon. Gone were the Italian marble, hand-knotted Persian rugs, and custom lighting that had defined our shared spaces. Instead, institutional beige walls and industrial fluorescent lighting created an atmosphere intentionally devoid of comfort or status. I sat alone at a metal table in the visitors' room, having insisted that Eleanor wait outside despite her vehement objections. This conversation needed to happen without witnesses, not to protect Craig, but to ensure I could respond authentically to whatever manipulation he attempted. When the guards finally brought him in, I barely recognized the man I married 15 years earlier. Just 24 hours in custody had stripped away the polished veneer he had always maintained. His designer suit had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on his frame. Without access to his extensive grooming regimen, his hair fell limply across his forehead, and stubble shadowed his jawline. Most striking was the absence of the confident, charismatic energy he typically projected, that invisible force field of charm and authority that had convinced so many people to trust him with their money, their health, their futures. The guards secured his handcuffs to a ring embedded in the table before stepping back to positions near the door. For a long moment, we simply regarded each other in silence. Two people who had shared a bed, a home, a life, now separated by metal restraints and criminal charges. "You look well," Craig finally said, his voice smaller than I remembered. "Your press conference was impressive. Very controlled, very strategic." I didn't respond to the compliment, if that's what it was intended to be. "I'm told you have information about patient safety protocols that weren't documented. Lives are at risk, Craig. This isn't the time for games." He leaned forward slightly, the handcuffs clinking against the metal ring. "Always straight to business. That was one of the things I admired about you, you know. No unnecessary emotional preamble. And yet you consistently dismissed my business acumen as meddling," I observed. One of many contradictions in how you chose to see me. A flicker of something, regret, annoyance, crossed his face before he composed himself again. "I underestimated you, clearly." He glanced around the detention center visiting room. "A mistake I'm paying for rather dramatically." "You're paying for systematic fraud that endangered patients and stole from investors," I corrected him. "My role was simply ensuring the truth came to light. Now, the safety information you claim to have, it exists," he interrupted, leaning forward with sudden intensity. "But I need certain assurances before I share it. Considerations in the prosecution's approach. Perhaps your testimony focused more on corporate mismanagement rather than deliberate fraud." I regarded him with genuine curiosity. Even now, handcuffed and facing multiple federal indictments, he was attempting to negotiate, to leverage, to manipulate. "Let me be clear," I said, keeping my voice measured. "I will not perjure myself or compromise the investigation in any way. If patient safety is truly at risk, you have a moral obligation to provide that information immediately and unconditionally. Craig's expression hardened. Moral obligations? That's rich coming from the woman who spent 6 months building a case against her husband while pretending everything was normal, who invited his mistress to her birthday party knowing federal agents were standing by to make an arrest. I didn't invite Vanessa, I reminded him. You orchestrated that particular humiliation yourself. I simply chose not to warn you about the consequences. The mention of Vanessa's name caused a subtle shift in Craig's demeanor. How is she? He asked, his voice softening slightly. The baby? Currently hospitalized due to stress-induced complications, I informed him, watching his reaction carefully. The doctors are working to prevent premature labor. She's also cooperating with federal investigators, which I would recommend you consider as well. His jaw tightened at this news. Of course she is. Everyone's scrambling to save themselves. He leaned back as far as the restraints would allow. Including you, Rebecca. Don't pretend this crusade was purely about justice. You enjoyed watching me fall. Planned it meticulously, in fact. I considered his accusation thoughtfully. There was a certain satisfaction, I admitted, not in causing pain, but in ensuring accountability, in watching truth overcome deception. Is that revenge? Perhaps, but it's also justice. His gaze flickered, away from mine, unable to maintain eye contact in the face of this honesty. For a moment, I glimpsed the vulnerable man beneath the charismatic persona he had cultivated, someone driven by profound insecurity, always needing to prove his brilliance, his value, his superiority. The safety protocols, I prompted, redirecting our conversation to its intended purpose. You said they were intentionally kept off official documentation. Craig sighed, seeming to realize that his leverage had evaporated. The cardiac devices in the MX500 series have an undocumented reset sequence. If they detect certain arrhythmia patterns, they enter a diagnostic mode that can be misinterpreted as device failure. Physicians need to know the proper reset protocol. I pulled a small notebook from my bag, making detailed notes of his explanation. Why wasn't this included in the documentation provided to doctors? Competitive reasons, he admitted. The diagnostic capability is similar to one patented by a rival company. We implemented it differently, but not differently enough to guarantee we wouldn't face patent infringement claims if it was fully documented. The calculated risk he had taken with patients' lives to avoid potential legal complications was breathtaking in its callousness. How many patients have these devices? Approximately 8,000 globally, 3,000 in the US. He provided additional technical details about the reset sequence, which I carefully recorded. I'll ensure this information reaches Dr. Jameson and the FDA immediately, I said, closing my notebook. Is there anything else patients or their physicians should know? Craig hesitated, and I recognized the familiar calculation in his eyes, weighing what to reveal against what to withhold for potential future leverage. Everything, Craig, I insisted. Lives are at stake. Craig's internal struggle played across his face, the businessman weighing assets against liabilities, the strategist calculating his remaining moves in a game he was clearly losing. Finally, something shifted in his expression, a subtle surrender I'd never witnessed before. There's a firmware issue with the neural stimulation devices in the NC300 series, he admitted, his voice dropping to ensure the guards couldn't overhear. If patients undergo MRI scanning, the devices can overheat. We discovered it during late-stage testing but determined it was a rare enough occurrence that disclosing it would cause more panic than protection. I wrote this information down with steady hands, though inwardly I felt sick at the calculated risk he had taken with patients' lives. How many people have these devices implanted? Around 1,200, primarily for experimental treatment of Parkinson's and epilepsy. He provided the specific model numbers and technical details for identifying affected patients. Anything else? I pressed, studying his face for signs of continued withholding. Craig hesitated, then seemed to make a final decision. The documentation, for all trials conducted through our Singapore subsidiary, was systematically altered. The actual raw data is stored on a separate server accessible only through a specific VPN connection. He provided the access details, passwords, and file locations. As I finished recording this last piece of information, I closed my notebook and met his gaze directly. I'll ensure all of this reaches the appropriate medical authorities immediately. Whatever happens with the legal proceedings, Craig, at least you've done this one right thing. His laugh was hollow, without humor. Don't mistake self-preservation for redemption, Rebecca. I'm simply hedging my bets. He glanced down at his handcuffed wrists. The prosecutors might view cooperation on patient safety matters favorably. Despite everything, I felt a wave of sadness for the man before me. Someone so fundamentally incapable of authentic moral action that even potentially saving lives had to be framed as a strategic advantage. The tragedy wasn't just what Craig had done, but who he had always been beneath the charismatic facade. You know what I find most remarkable? I asked, gathering my belongings. Not the fraud itself, but how unnecessary it was. You had genuine brilliance, Craig. Legitimate innovations that could have changed lives for the better. You could have built something meaningful without the deception. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps the closest approximation to regret he was capable of feeling. The legitimate work was slower, messier, less guaranteed. Investors wanted certainty I couldn't honestly provide. Regulators demanded timelines that honest research couldn't meet. He shrugged slightly. The first compromise was the hardest. After that, each one became easier. I stood, signaling to the guards that our meeting was concluding. I imagined the same was true in our marriage. Craig looked up at me, suddenly appearing older than his 45 years. I did love you, Rebecca. In the beginning, before everything became so complicated. I believe you did, I acknowledged, surprised by the lack of bitterness I felt. But you loved the idea of success more, the appearance of perfection, the admiration of others. In the end, those were always going to matter more to you than any person. Me, Vanessa, even your unborn child. As the guards moved to escort him back to his cell, Craig called out one final question. Was any of it real for you, these past few years? I paused, considering how to answer. The commitment was real, I said finally. Even after I stopped loving you, I honored the commitment I had made, until I discovered your betrayal wasn't just personal but extended to patients whose lives were at risk. That was the line, Craig. Not Vanessa, not the pregnancy, not even the financial fraud. It was knowing you were willing to let people die to preserve your image and wealth. His shoulders slumped slightly at this assessment. The guards led him away without further exchange, the door closing with a heavy metallic thud that seemed to punctuate the end of our 15-year marriage more definitively than any divorce decree could. Outside the detention center, Eleanor waited with barely contained impatience, pacing beside her parked car. Well, was it actually about patient safety or just another manipulation? Both, I replied, handing her my notebook. He provided critical safety information, but only as a calculated attempt to gain cooperation leverage with prosecutors. Slid into the passenger seat as Eleanor started the engine. We need to get this to Dr. Jameson immediately. There are thousands of patients with potentially dangerous devices. As we drove toward Massachusetts General Hospital, Eleanor glanced at me with concern. Are you all right? Seeing Craig like that couldn't have been easy, regardless of everything he's done. I gazed out the window at the Boston skyline, considering her question. It was clarifying. The man I just spoke with is who Craig always was beneath the charm and confidence. I'm not sure I ever truly knew him. Or perhaps I simply chose not to see the reality. That's not unusual in cases like this, Eleanor noted. Spouses of white-collar criminals often report a similar experience. the realization that they've been living with a carefully constructed persona rather than an authentic person. At the hospital, we found Dr. Jameson in conversation with several colleagues in the cardiac unit conference room. He excused himself immediately upon seeing us. "Mrs. Westlake, we've already begun contacting patients with Meridian devices," he reported. "So far, we haven't identified any emergency situations, but we're proceeding with an abundance of caution." I handed him my notebook, opened to the pages detailing Craig's revelations. "This information needs to be distributed to all medical professionals treating patients with these specific devices immediately. There are undocumented safety protocols and potential hazards that could have life-threatening implications." Dr. Jameson scanned the notes, his expression growing increasingly grave. Undisclosed overheating risk during MRIs? Hidden reset protocols? He looked up, visibly disturbed. "This goes beyond regulatory corner cutting. These omissions could directly endanger patients." "I know," I acknowledged quietly. "That's why I met with Craig despite the legal complications it might create. Whatever happens with the criminal proceedings, ensuring patient safety has to be the priority." The doctor nodded, already moving toward his colleagues with renewed urgency. "We'll implement emergency notification protocols immediately. Thank you for obtaining this information. It will quite literally save lives." As Dr. Jameson coordinated the medical response, Eleanor checked her phone and frowned. "The Meridian Tech Board has called another emergency session. Apparently, preliminary audit results are even worse than anticipated. The company may not survive in any recognizable form." I had anticipated this possibility from the beginning of my investigation, but the reality still carried weight. Meridian Tech employed hundreds of people: scientists, engineers, administrative staff, most of whom had no knowledge of or involvement in Craig's fraud. "What about the building?" Eleanor asked. "As majority owner of the property company, you have significant influence over what happens next." I had been considering this question since the previous night. The building represented not just a valuable real estate asset, but leverage in ensuring the most ethical resolution for all parties involved. "I've already reached out to Biogen and Novartis," I informed her. "Both have expressed interest in acquiring Meridian's legitimate research divisions and retaining most of the scientific staff. The building lease will be structured to facilitate that transition, favorable terms for any acquirer who preserves jobs and continues the non-compromised research." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Always 10 steps ahead. Have you given any thought to what comes next for you personally? After the legal proceedings conclude?" The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on building the case against Craig, then ensuring justice for all affected parties, that I had given little consideration to my own future beyond the immediate crisis. "Not specifically," I admitted, though I've received inquiries from several patient advocacy organizations about potential leadership roles. My experience with Meridian has given me unique insight into the intersection of corporate oversight and patient safety. We paused our conversation as we reached Vanessa's hospital room. Through the partially open door, I could see her sleeping peacefully, the fetal monitor displaying reassuringly regular patterns. Attorney Winters sat quietly in the corner, reviewing documents while maintaining a protective presence. "She's doing better," the attorney informed us in a hushed voice. "The doctors are optimistic they can maintain the pregnancy for at least another month, which would significantly improve outcomes for the baby." "Has she been informed about Craig's cooperation regarding the safety information?" I asked, briefly. She seemed relieved that he had made at least one decision that wasn't entirely self-serving. Attorney Winters gathered her papers. "The prosecutors have formally designated her as a cooperating witness rather than a target of the investigation. Her testimony about the financial manipulations she witnessed will be valuable in building the case." As we left the maternity ward, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking. FDA orders. Immediate safety review of all Meridian Tech medical devices. Patients urged to contact healthcare providers. The story was accompanied by a statement from Dr. Jameson's medical response team, already implementing the safety protocols Craig had revealed. "It's happening quickly," Eleanor observed as we reached the hospital lobby. "The ripple effects will continue for months, possibly years. Regulatory, investigations, civil lawsuits, criminal proceedings. But patients will be protected," I noted, finding genuine satisfaction in that knowledge. And the truth has come to light. Whatever else happens, those two outcomes make everything worthwhile. Outside the hospital, the late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the parking lot. 48 hours had passed since Vanessa had stood in my living room announcing her pregnancy and engagement, a moment that now seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. "What will you do about your birthday?" Eleanor asked unexpectedly as we reached her car. 40 is still a milestone worth celebrating, despite the extraordinary circumstances. I hadn't given any thought to my interrupted birthday celebration. Amidst the whirlwind of Craig's arrest and its aftermath, the elaborate party I had planned, the one that had transformed into the setting for both public humiliation and vindicating revelation, felt like an artifact from someone else's life. "Perhaps something quiet," I suggested. "A small dinner, with you, Mother Sophia, people who stood by me through this entire ordeal." Eleanor smiled, squeezing my hand affectionately. "A fresh start seems appropriate. After all, you're beginning this decade with a clean slate, personally, professionally, financially." As we drove away from the hospital, I found myself contemplating the extraordinary path that had led me here. 6 months ago, the discovery of Craig's affair with Vanessa had been painful, but clarifying. The catalyst that had prompted me to look more deeply into aspects of our shared life I had previously accepted without question. That initial betrayal had opened the door to discovering the much larger deceptions that affected thousands of innocent people. Had Vanessa not chosen my birthday party for her dramatic announcement, had Craig not been so confident in his ability to control the narrative, the events might have unfolded very differently. There was indeed a certain poetic justice in how their attempt to humiliate me had instead accelerated their downfall. "The federal prosecutor called while you were meeting with Craig," Eleanor mentioned as we turned onto the street leading to my home. "They're moving forward with all 27 counts in the indictment. Given the evidence and mounting witness cooperation, they're confident of conviction on most, if not all, charges." I nodded, unsurprised by this development. The case against Craig was overwhelming. Meticulously documented financial fraud, falsified regulatory submissions, misappropriation of company funds, and now the intentional concealment of critical safety information. "What about the others involved?" I asked, thinking of the executives who had enabled Craig's fraud through active participation or willing blindness. "The investigation is expanding daily," Eleanor confirmed. 3 more arrests this afternoon, including the chief financial officer and head of regulatory affairs. The prosecutors are working from the top down, building cases against the most culpable parties first, then using their testimony to reach others. As we pulled into my driveway, I noticed the absence of media vans that had surrounded my home. That morning, the news cycle was already shifting focus from the personal drama of Craig's arrest at my birthday party to the broader implications for patients, investors, and the biotech industry as a whole. "Life will eventually return to normal," Eleanor observed, following my gaze. "Different normal, certainly, but the spotlight will move on." I smiled at her reassurance, though I suspected she was partially right. The intense public scrutiny would indeed fade as Craig's case moved through the legal system. But nothing would ever truly return to normal, nor did I want it to. The woman who had accepted Craig's deceptions, who had subordinated her own instincts and intelligence to preserve a marriage that existed more in appearance than reality, was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer, more resolute, a woman who had faced betrayal on multiple levels and responded not with helpless victimhood, but with strategic action and unwavering determination to expose the truth. regardless of personal cost. "I'm not sure I want normal," I admitted as we walked toward the front door. "I think I'm ready for something entirely new." 6 months later, the Boston skyline gleamed in the spring sunshine as I signed the final paperwork transferring ownership of the Meridian Tech building to NewGen Biomedical, the company formed from the legitimate research divisions of Craig's collapsed empire. True to my word, I had structured the deal to preserve over 150 scientific positions while ensuring patient safety protocols were permanently embedded in the corporate structure. "Congratulations," Marcus said, sliding the signed documents back across the conference table. As interim CEO, he had successfully shepherded the company through its most difficult transition. Not many people would have used their leverage to save jobs rather than maximize profit. I smiled, thinking of how much had changed since that fateful birthday night. The building was never about profit for me. It was about justice, and justice includes protecting innocent parties. Outside the glass-walled conference room, researchers and engineers moved purposefully through the renovated space, focused on projects that might genuinely improve lives without the pressure of Craig's fraudulent timelines and manipulated data. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "Lily took her first steps today. Video attached. Hospital board approved my healthcare advocacy proposal. Thank you again for the recommendation." I watched the short clip of her daughter, Craig's daughter, taking wobbly steps across a sunlit nursery floor. Despite the complicated circumstances of her birth, little Lily had thrived, entering the world 2 weeks early, but perfectly healthy. Vanessa, too, had found unexpected strength, parlaying her experience into a patient advocacy role after her testimony helped secure Craig's conviction on 23 of 27 counts. The irony wasn't lost on me. Craig's attempt to start a second family had instead created an unlikely alliance between his wife and Mistress, both determined to repair the damage his fraud had caused to patients and the medical community. "Ready for your meeting at the foundation?" Eleanor asked, appearing at the conference room door. Since the case concluded, she had helped me restructure my charitable work into a formal patient safety organization, using the substantial divorce settlement to fund initiatives that increased transparency in medical device testing and approval. "Just one more thing to do," I replied, removing my wedding ring for the first time since the divorce had been finalized weeks earlier. I placed it in a small envelope addressed to the Victims' Compensation Fund, a symbolic gesture perhaps, but a meaningful one. As we left the building, I paused to look back at what had once been the crown jewel of Craig's empire, and was now something more honest, more valuable. A place where science served people rather than profit, where success was measured in lives improved rather than stock prices inflated. In the end, Craig's pregnant mistress announcing their engagement at my birthday party hadn't destroyed me as he had intended. Instead, it had become the catalyst for my own transformation, from supporting character in someone else's story to the architect of justice that affected thousands of lives. Sometimes, I reflected as we drove away, the most devastating moments in our lives can unlock our greatest strengths, if we choose to see them not as endings but as unexpected beginnings.